So my presentation will be discussing the effects of right hemisphere damage on communication and language. So for the introduction, in the brain there are two hemispheres, the right and the left. This research specifically focuses on the right hemisphere of the brain, which is responsible for problem solving, memory, reasoning, and attention. Damage to the right hemisphere of the brain can negatively impact one's ability to communicate with others. Direct impacts on communication may include issues with social communication, including jokes or nonverbal cues, or being able to organize information. Damage to the right hemisphere of the brain can occur in different ways, including strokes, tumors, or traumatic brain injuries. A speech pathologist will work with a person who is suspected of having symptoms that are a result of injury to the right hemisphere. The speech pathologist will administer certain assessments to specifically test the function of the right hemisphere to determine the severity of the effects on communication and how to best treat these problems. The goal of this research paper is to examine direct impacts of right hemisphere damage on a group of individuals' communication abilities and the likelihood of these difficulties occurring in a person who has this damage. Another important aspect of this topic is the treatment of these communication difficulties and how successful they have been proven to be. So for learner outcomes, things that will be discussed will be how does the right hemisphere impact communication and language, and what effects will damage to the right hemisphere have on communication and language. So the participants in this study, this research included data from approximately 65 adults who were selected based on the fact that they have right hemisphere brain damage. Aside from the 65 adults across the studies, in many circumstances, there were control groups who had participants with no brain damage. The primary language of participants was English, and many of these participants were around ages 40 to 70 and suffered from strokes. Procedures. This narrative was conducted by examining existing research data involving right hemisphere brain damage to investigate the impact right hemisphere brain damage has on communication and language abilities. Data was collected through study of research journals, the Journal of Neurolinguistics, etc. 7 journal articles were used in this study. Following review of the study's findings were described. So for the measures, in this research, the studies mentioned above contain multiple different materials used to measure hypotheses and find results. Some of the materials included the Montreal Protocol for the Evaluation of Communication, which was administered to assess presenting communication symptoms in a man with right hemisphere brain damage. In the same study, the MEC Protocol Communication Screening Questionnaire was used with the spouse of the man with the right hemisphere brain damage to get insight into his condition and how his communication has changed in suffering from a stroke. Barnes et al. 2019. In another study, the Brazilian version of the MAC battery was administered to verify the effect of right hemisphere brain damage on communication processing. And that's Francesca et al. 2007. In another study, the discourse comprehension test was used in the audio tape format. In this test, the speaker read a practice story followed by 5 test stories. Brady et al. 2006. Comprehension was tested using 8 yes or no questions. A few studies also use video and audio recording as a testing material to later analyze and compare results to the hypothesis. So this research will be exploring how damage to the right hemisphere of the brain affects speech and language. The right hemisphere of the brain is an important part of many communication skills. According to ASHA, right hemisphere damage is an acquired brain injury that is usually secondary to a traumatic brain injury or stroke. This damage will typically cause impairments in language and cognitive domains that affect communication. The specific processes that are usually negatively impacted are semantic processing of words, discourse processing, prosody, and pragmatics. Impairments in cognitive domains such as attention, memory, and executive functioning can also be impaired. So the first article that's going to be discussed is titled, What is the Impact of Right versus Left Hemisphere Brain Damage? This study was conducted to show how individuals with right hemisphere brain damage and left hemisphere brain damage use communicative conceptual gestures. For this research, emphasis on the effects of the right hemisphere will be the focus. Participants in this study consisted of 38 patients and 20 healthy individuals in the control group. 18 of those patients suffered from right hemisphere brain damage. Participants completed questionnaires about hand preference, aphasia assessment, and analysis of videotape hand movement. The results showed that the right brain damaged participants showed a lower mean number of phasic in-space movements, conceptual hand movements, and repetitive on-body movements than the control group and left brain disorder group. Overall findings showed that right brain damage leads to a decrease in the production of gestures. And that's Hogreff et al. 2016. So the next article was Everyday Conversation After Right Hemisphere Brain Damage. This article discusses right hemisphere brain damage and how it impairs lexical processing, prosodic processing, and discourse and pragmatics. There were 3 participants in the study. The first one was a man who had experienced a single right hemisphere stroke. The second was his female spouse, and the last participant was a family friend. The Montreal Protocol for the Evaluation of Communication was administered to assess Bill's presenting communication symptoms. His spouse was administered the MEC Protocol Communication Screening Questionnaire, and all participated in conversation recording. Results showed that many of Bill's responses are fitted and are appropriately sensitive to the implications of response mobilizing tools. Results also supported the idea that core aspects of conversational practices used by people with right hemisphere brain damage are largely consistent with typical speakers. And that's Barnes et al., 2019. For future research should be done to further examine areas of communication and language that are negatively affected by right hemisphere brain damage, as well as to help speech pathologists to be knowledgeable about the best treatment practices for clients who are suffering from right hemisphere damage. And in conclusion, the research question, how does right hemisphere brain damage affect communication and language abilities, was answered through different tests and assessment measures that showed that some specific parts of language are negatively affected by right hemisphere brain damage. Some of the specific communication areas affected included discursive and lexical, semantic, and prosodic processes. Participants also showed some difficulty with conversations.